Hello everyone, it's Tuesday and you're watching Within the Frame. I'm Kim Bo-kyung. Just around a month ago, the U.S. and China agreed to resume military-to-military communications after a summit at a historic country estate near San Francisco as part of an effort to ease tensions. However, the hotline has not been restored until now. The U.S. is still imposing export restrictions on China, while China is keeping its trade curbs on critical materials. That being said, though many say the U.S.-China relationship is in a much better place than before, it is true that bilateral ties are still very fragile. With many major events scheduled for next year, how do experts forecast 2024 when it comes to Washington-Beijing ties? For this, we invite Professor ZHANG from the University of Kansas. Welcome, Professor Zhang.
Thanks for having me.
And we also have Su Chin-do, a senior fellow from Pangol Institution. Good to see you, Mr. Su.
Good to see you again.
All right, first question to our Professor Zhang. Latest news first. Chinese President Xi Jinping visited Vietnam for his first state visit in 6 years, and the two sides signed 37 agreements. What was agreed during Xi's recent Hanoi visit, and what was the significance of the trip?
Well, I think it would be quite boring for me to list all 37 agreements. I would say some highlights include cross-border railway and telecommunication linkages and digital trade. But I think the important thing to recognize here is the context, right? So first, China is facing serious economic headwinds coming out of its self-imposed zero-COVID isolation last year. Its international image, especially in terms of public opinion, I think has suffered also in recent years. And finally, it faces intensifying economic and technological containment from the U.S. and its allies. And so this is the 9th state visit, I believe, since last September. My presidency is the third to an ASEAN country. And, you know, ASEAN in general, right, and Vietnam in particular are really important partners for China economically and politically. And so I see this visit as a campaign to mend ties in the region with an important neighbor. And the timing is particularly significant because it's coming after President Biden's state visit to Vietnam earlier this year.
Right, like our Professor Zhang already pointed out, Mr. Su, such a visit to Vietnam came just 3 months after U.S. President Joe Biden traveled to Hanoi in September. And at that time, Washington and Hanoi upgraded their relationship to comprehensive strategic partnership. What are the reasons behind these two major powers vying for influence in the Southeast Asian nation?
If you look at the China-U.S. relationship, in particular with the regional countries like Vietnam, and many people would describe this as a vying influence between the two superpowers. But if you want to be accurate, you would say the U.S. is trying to contain China. Of course, they want to draw regional countries like Indonesia, like Vietnam, to join this Indo-Pacific strategy, which is solely focusing on China. Basically to have Vietnam against China. That's the U.S. purpose, that's very clear. But if you look at the China-Vietnam relationship, I would say it's more than that, to say the least. It's really about more about the bilateral relationship, just as Professor Zhang pointed out. If you look at the agreements between the two countries, it's about substantial cooperation in terms of infrastructure, in terms of digital trade under the Belt and Road Initiative, for example, as well as people-to-people exchanges. They are important neighbors, and also they have the same ideology. Both countries are run by the Communist Party, and also they have the same idea in terms of the ideology, in terms of political system, in terms of the practice of running their country. So I think people should not forget about that. So, for China, it's not about having Vietnam against the U.S. It's really about strengthening bilateral ties and strengthening relationship with ASEAN, the regional bloc. In that sense, that's already served the interests of the Chinese side. China is playing defense against the U.S. containment, and ideologically, militarily, and economically. So that's the nature, I would say, in terms of this visit.
All right, I see your point. So for U.S., visiting Vietnam is more of containing China, and also for China, it's more of bolstering ties with Vietnam. I see your point. Now, Professor Zhang, staying on China's diplomacy front, China and North Korea held high-level talks in Beijing for the first time almost in 4 years. Not many details were released, but the two sides reportedly agreed to strengthen their relationship ahead of the 75th anniversary of establishing diplomatic ties next year. Could this be part of efforts to bolster bilateral ties that have been a bit loosened recently, or just a gesture to manage existing ties?
Yeah, I am not an expert on North Korea, and we can only speculate, right, that there is some movement in the wake of the Ukraine conflict, right, and North Korea has been moving to take advantage of this opening to strengthen ties with both Russia and with China, and I think. I'd like to turn back to the Vietnam point actually a little bit, and where I think more needs to be said about how we can applaud Vietnam's diplomacy in recent years. I think, right, no country has a more complicated relationship with China and the United States, right, and it's the only country that has managed to host state visits by both President Xi and President Biden this past year. Right, Vietnam fought the American War with the U.S. in the 1960s, fought China in 1979, but yet since establishing diplomatic relations with both countries, its bamboo diplomacy has been incredibly pragmatic in maintaining good relations with both powers. And it's managed to upgrade comprehensive strategic cooperative partnerships with China, I think, back in 2018, and now with the U.S. in 2023. And so I think, right, the state visit here is holds some lessons, I think, for middle powers to navigating this intensifying U.S.-China rivalry. I suspect that other countries in the region, including North Korea, are doing a similar sort of balancing effort, right? Taking advantage of openings and trying to strengthen ties where either the U.S. or China are open to them.
All right, I see, Professor Zhang. Now, delving a little bit deeper into U.S.-China ties, Mr. Su. Last month, when the Biden and Xi summit took place, one of the major achievements was the resumption of a military hotline. However, it has not been restored yet. Why the delay?
Good question. I think, if you look at the summit, for the U.S., the purpose is to we are not having the fierce competition with China, which is so fierce that sometimes it could be out of control. So we need to talk to each other. That's the U.S. idea. That does not mean the change of policy or alleviation of U.S. pressure on China or the economic war on China. But for the Chinese side, the purpose is really about, let's bring our relationship back on track, on the more stable and more peaceful course, let's say. So they have different purposes and different ideas. Despite the differences, they did achieve like a stable, more stable relationship, let's say, compared with the past. That's a big achievement, including, say, agreeing to restart the communication between their militaries. But if you look at the responses, even during the summit or right after the summit, in some areas they acted quickly. For example, from the Chinese side, to agreeing to help the U.S. with the fight against drugs, fentanyl, for example. The Chinese side acted very quickly, and the U.S. side did that too. But in some areas, you do see there's I wouldn't call it a delay. It's a slow, at least, especially in the military area. I think for the Chinese side, people, do have doubts. What is, the point of having a hotline or communication between the two militaries, because the U.S. seems, focusing on containing China, focusing on supporting the Philippines, for example, to provoke crisis one after the other in the South China Sea, or sending aircraft carrier, navigating through the Taiwan Straits, challenging the Chinese sovereignty over there. The U.S. is not changing its behavior at all in this region. So the Chinese would ask the question, okay, with the hotline, with the communication, what's in there for us? What can we benefit from such a scenario? Of course, the U.S. would see that's a way to avoid military conflicts. But for the Chinese side, you should not behave in a manner that will create conflicts in the first place. Without such a military contact, probably you would be more cautious in your behavior. But with such a hotline, with such a military encounter, the U.S. could do whatever they could do. They can do to provoke. From the Chinese point, there's really not much to gain to have this close military-to-military conflict. But still, with that being said, obviously they do have military conflicts. At different levels, officials they are talking to each other.
I see. So basically, China right now has doubts over the point of, or the purpose of having this military hotline regarding the United States. All right. Now, Professor Zhang, adding on to that, export controls between the two countries have continued as well. The U.S. House even called for a reset of U.S.-China economic relations, saying China's economic system is not compatible with the WTO, while China, too, has been imposing raw material export curbs. Could you walk us through the situation here?
I think the important thing for your viewers to understand is that the U.S. has separation of powers and that policy on almost everything, right, but especially on China, is contested and it's not often coordinated between branches of government. So I really welcome the efforts made in San Francisco to stabilize the U.S.-China bilateral relationship and prevent a further deterioration. That is a White House effort, and I know the folks who worked hard to make that happen. But the White House can't tell the House Select Committee on what to do, and especially not on what to say. So yes, and export controls are still in place. What I work on, tariffs are still in place. And more frustrating for me are the simple things that were put into place during the pandemic and a period of worse U.S.-China relationships, like the State Department's travel warning on China. Those things are still in place and make it hard for study abroad programs at universities like mine, right? So these simple things take some time, I think, to unravel, but hopefully, we'll see that, and people-to-people exchanges can happen. I mean, the other thing that we all need to keep in mind is that it's an election year here in the United States in 2024, and I think President Biden's team is very worried about, appearing or being labeled as soft on China. I happen to think that is, misguided, and that no matter what, if he's facing, former President Trump again, that accusation is going to be levied with or without sort of, policy content and actions. And I hope that the team in the White House can help at least unravel some of these things that are not that are mutually sort of harmful, like the travel warning that's still in place.
All right, I see your point. Well, Professor Zhang, one more question. Escalating export curves and maintaining remaining curves definitely shows us the accelerating fragmentation of the world economy into regional power blocks centered, of course, around the U.S. and China. And regarding this, officials from the IMF pointed out that this could cut global GDP by 7%. Could you explain how U.S.-China tension could affect the world economically?
Yeah, I haven't heard that particular quote or estimate before, but I think the concern is not too far off the mark. U.S.-China competition threatens the prevailing trend of globalization that's generated so much prosperity for the world in general, and for East Asia in particular over the last 40 years. I think countries like Vietnam and South Korea that have strong economic and ties with both the U.S. and China have benefited from this trend, and that a return to a Cold War, is undesirable, right? That life today is definitely, with peace, is definitely preferable to the proxy sort of conflicts that were fought in these countries between the U.S. and China in the past. And so I think the escalating U.S.-China rivalry poses risks to the world economy in at least two important ways. In the short term, there's pressure to decouple and de-risk from China, and that's going to generate some adjustment costs and policy uncertainty as companies try to reorient their supply chains and adjust to this new reality, right? The uncertainty of this. And so there's also going to be pressure on countries to to choose sides. I think in the longer term and more worrying is that, traditionally economic interdependence is viewed as something that constrains military conflict, right? And so if the U.S. and China are both positioning their economies to reduce economic interdependencies on each other in the name of national security, I think ironically both sides are actually destroying a lot of these restraints that were previously in place, and making military escalation, if not more likely, then at least less costly. Right. And so, the slide towards an unthinkable sort of conflict between two nuclear powers, right? There's fewer checks in that process. And that's sort of the more worrying dimension that this competition can pose, and why I think efforts to try to put guardrails or floor, whatever metaphor you want to use, to make sure that we don't get there are so important.
All right, I see. Now, Mr. Su, back to diplomacy. U.S.-China diplomatic tension centers around Taiwan as well. And on January 13th, voters will elect Taiwan's next president as well as his legislature. Lai Ching-le from the Democratic Progressive Party and the Kuomintang's Hu Yu-yi are reportedly in fierce competition. Could you tell us about this, and how are U.S. and China viewing this election?
Well, yes, you're right. Lai Ching-le from the ruling party, or DPP, which is the independence-minded party. Lai Ching-le calls himself as a realistic worker for Taiwan independence. Now, here is the key word is Taiwan independence. For anyone who follow the Taiwan situation, we understand that the bottom line for the Chinese side is Taiwan independence. Let me be frank. If there's a Taiwan independence, for example, declaration of such a state, that basically means a conflict. That basically means a war. So for the Chinese side, basically, the idea is and whatever situation, the country will achieve its national reunification through whatever means. No country will be allowed to prevent China from achieving that goal. Of course, the preferable means is through peaceful negotiation, through peaceful talks between the two sides. But if you have Lai Ching-le, here comes Lai Ching-le, that's the danger or the potential risks if there's a presidency in Lai Ching-le. Not only the Chinese side, but also the American side is also worried about Lai Ching-le. That's also the truth. That is, the U.S. does not like to see someone, you can call them a troublemaker for Washington, because Washington's strategy, to see the Taiwan as a strategic asset against China, is lying in a state of division between the mainland and Taiwan. But it does not lie in the independent Taiwan. If there's independence of Taiwan, that means trouble for Washington. That could mean a direct military conflict between Beijing and Washington. That's not something either side wants to have. So that's the situation with the candidate Lai Ching-le. Hu Yu-yi is seen as from the party KMT, which is seen as China friendly. But for the Chinese side, whoever will be the leader of Taiwan, it does not make a big difference in the real sense. Because it's really about the contact between the peoples, it's about the trade between the two sides, it's about the general trend or the comparison of, let's say, economic or military strengths between the two sides. And also remember, whatever any reunification, or in particular peaceful reunification, will go through Washington. But now we do have a difficult situation. That is, Washington has basically changed its idea. It's a one China policy here. So the status quo has been changed. Washington, in the real sense, they will not welcome even a peaceful reunification between the two sides. That's a challenge, and of course, that will affect Washington's stance on which candidate they prefer, or which candidate they will give some support, usually in a very subtle way.
All right, I see. Well, until now, we have been talking about the Taiwanese election, but Mr. Su, what's more directly linked to Washington-Beijing ties would be, of course, the U.S. presidential election. And all eyes are on whether former President Donald Trump will be able to begin his second administration. Though we will have to wait and see about this, what would a Trump win mean in terms of relationship with China?
Well, I think Professor Zhang would be an expert on the U.S. politics, but from the Chinese side, I would say, yes, you do have a Biden presidency, for example, the second term. That's I don't think the Chinese side expect much to gain from a second term of Biden presidency, except for we can continue with this strained relationship between Beijing and Washington. Many people expected a change of policy, from Washington right after the victory of Biden, election victory, a few years back. But they proved to be wrong, and Biden basically doubled down the China policy, Trump's China policy on Beijing, with a lot of harsher economic policies on China. Export restriction, economic war, tax war on China. So that's expected to continue if there's a second term for Biden. And if there's a Trump administration, or second term for Trump, people don't see much change probably in that respect, despite the potential of the personal relationship between the two leaders, potentially Xi Jinping and Trump. Maybe they can talk to each other probably more easily in a different way than between Xi Jinping and Biden. But I don't think there will be much change in terms of the economic relationship, for example.
All right, not much difference expected. Now, we are running out of time, but I'd like to ask this last question to our Professor Zhang. Now, wrapping this up, how might Washington-Beijing ties be in the near future? Could you briefly tell us?
Sure. As I mentioned earlier, it is an election year here in the U.S., so I agree with Mr. Xu that there's not a lot of hope for any kind of policy adjustment out of Washington. And in the meantime, then the onus is on Beijing, I think, to be patient and manage the relationship responsibly until after we're here in the U.S. we call election season, silly season, right? But I think there's some room for hope in that I don't think that the U.S. public is so implacable when it comes to China as policymakers in Washington seem to believe. And I think that the benefits of the existing relationship has not been clearly articulated. And more importantly, I think the costs of confrontation or conflict and what that means for average Americans is not being discussed enough. And I think it will be more obscured with a Trump presidency than with the Biden one. And so, sadly, the truth is there is a bipartisan consensus around, competition with China here, and so it doesn't really matter. I agree which party or which president comes into power. A lot of the orientation of policy out of Washington is not going to change. But I think if we're going to be in this world of competition, I think Washington actually has a lot to learn from capitals in Asia, from Hanoi and from Seoul, than the other way around, because East Asia has been managing competition with China. The longstanding sort of security concerns that we talked about earlier for a long time, but managed to deepen economic ties and balance economic growth and national security. And so I hope, right, where we can end up in the U.S.-China relationship is a similar sort of balance where, between these two imperatives. Thank you.
All right. Thank you for your point of view, Professor Zhang. Well, unfortunately, this is all the time we have for today's edition. Thank you, Professor Zhang and Mr. Su, for your time and insights. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right, that's all for Within the Frame tonight. We'll be back tomorrow with more in-depth stories. Thank you for watching, and goodbye.